It was the summer of 1945. The war in Europe had ended, yet for thousands of German women, the war had not truly stopped. They were prisoners now, far from home, far from everything they'd known. As their transport trucks rolled through the quiet roads of rural America, many of them stared in silence. The land looked untouched by war, green fields, white farmhouses, the hum of a peaceful country that had never felt the bombs. For the first time in years, they smelled fresh air that wasn't laced with smoke or fear. When the truck stopped at an American prisoner of war camp, the women braced themselves for harsh treatment, cold rations, anger, maybe revenge. After all, their homeland had brought so much suffering to this very nation, but what awaited them that evening would be something none of them could have imagined. Inside the camp's dining hall, long wooden tables gleamed beneath soft electric light. On those tables sat fresh bread, real butter, sweet fruit, and, to their disbelief, pies, not scraps, not stale war food, but food that looked like something out of a dream. And as they tasted it, warm bread melting with butter, the sweetness of apples, the creaminess of milk, the shock hit them harder than the cold Atlantic crossing ever had. In that moment, every belief they held about the enemy began to change. The first night was quiet. Too quiet for those who had spent years listening to the echo of bombs, the growl of sirens, and the endless shuffle of soldiers' boots. When the transport trucks came to a slow halt inside the fenced compound, the German women remained motionless for a few seconds, staring out the small openings of the canvas-covered trucks. They had crossed the ocean as captives, some still in their Wehrmacht uniforms, others in tattered clothes that barely held the dust of their ruined towns. Their eyes were hollow but alert, scanning every corner of this strange new world that looked nothing like war-torn Europe. They expected shouting, suspicion, perhaps even humiliation. But instead there was order, cleanliness, calm. The American guards moved with quiet efficiency, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. No one raised a hand. No one yelled. The only sound was the metallic creak of the gate closing behind them and the distant hum of an unseen generator that powered the floodlights. A few of the women exchanged nervous glances. If this was captivity, it was unlike anything they'd been told. For years, they'd been told America was a place of decadence and brutality. That the enemy despised them, would punish them, make them pay. But the men who stood by the gates looked normal. Some young enough to be their brothers, others carrying the quiet wariness of men who had seen too much and wished to see no more. As the women were guided toward a long, low building, the air changed. The smell hit them first, warm, savory, strangely comforting. It wasn't the sour stench of military soup or the faint rot of spoiled grain they'd grown used to. This was different. There was the unmistakable scent of fresh bread, the sweetness of something baked. One of the women, tall, blonde, barely 20, froze in place, her hand gripping her satchel tightly. "Do you smell that?" she whispered. Another nodded but said nothing, her eyes wide. It was the smell of peace, though they didn't have a word for it yet. Inside, the mess hall was bright. Electric light, soft but steady, flooded the wooden room. Rows of long tables stretched across the hall, polished to a dull shine. There were trays stacked neatly at one end, large silver kettles steaming gently. American cooks in white aprons. The air buzzed with the quiet clatter of utensils and the soft murmur of guards speaking in low tones. For a moment, the German women hesitated at the door, unsure if they were even supposed to enter. They had expected iron bars, not polished floors. They had imagined gruel, not warmth. A young American sergeant with sandy hair stepped forward, gesturing toward the tables. "Line up, please," he said in a calm, even voice. His German was broken but understandable. "You'll each receive a meal. No pushing. Everyone will be fed." The women exchanged wary looks. Some still clung to their belongings, letters, medals, fragments of home. Slowly, they moved toward the serving line. One by one, they were handed trays, heavy metallic, yet gleaming clean. The first woman in line blinked as a ladle poured thick stew into her dish, followed by a square of bread, a pat of butter, and something else. A slice of what looked like cake. She looked up at the cook in disbelief, as if waiting for him to laugh or snatch it back. But he only nodded toward the next in line. "Go on," he said kindly. "Eat while it's hot." No one spoke at first. The women found seats along the benches, their trays trembling slightly in their hands. The steam from the food curled upward, catching the light. One woman stared at the golden crust of the bread, torn perfectly from a fresh loaf. Another touched the butter, so soft it melted at her fingertips. She hadn't seen butter in years, not real butter, only substitutes, yellowed and bitter. And now here it was, rich and creamy, spreadable. When the first bite came, it was almost cautious, a small, careful taste, as though the food itself might betray them. Then silence. Forks paused midair, a few eyes closed, as if savoring not just the flavor, but the memory of something long forgotten. Warmth spread from tongue to heart, melting the frost that war had left behind. It wasn't just food. It was life returning, one mouthful at a time. For years they had eaten rations that barely kept them standing, thin soups, hard bread, sometimes nothing at all. Sugar had been a luxury, meat a rumor. In Germany's final months, even the hospitals had run out of flour. And now, here in a foreign land, the enemy was feeding them more generously than their own country ever could. The irony was too much for some. One woman lowered her fork, her eyes glistening. She whispered, "We destroyed their cities, and they give us bread." At another table, a group of younger prisoners whispered softly, their German words trembling with disbelief. "Why?" one asked. "Why would they do this for us?" None of them could answer. The thought lingered in the air, heavier than the scent of stew, sweeter than the taste of pie. In the kitchen, the American cooks continued their work quietly. To them, it was just another evening meal, another duty in a camp that had seen hundreds of POWs come and go. But to the women at those tables, it was something sacred. It was the first time in years that they had felt full. The first time they had eaten without fear, without the sound of planes overhead or the trembling of shelter walls. A guard passed by their tables, offering extra bread to those who had finished early. One of the women hesitated before taking a second slice. "Danke," she said softly. The guard smiled faintly and nodded. "You're welcome." That simple exchange broke something inside her, not in pain, but in realization. She had been taught to hate this uniform, this flag, yet here it was, serving her kindness on a plate. Later that night, as the women were escorted to their sleeping quarters, the camp was quiet again. But it wasn't the same silence that had greeted them hours before. This one felt gentler, the kind of silence that follows peace, not fear. The stars outside were sharp and bright, hanging over the distant fields like lanterns. Some of the women stood by the windows, looking out across the foreign land. The faint smell of baked bread still lingered in their hair, in their hands. One of them whispered to another, "If this is captivity, I could almost forget the war." The other smiled weakly. Almost. In the following days, they would learn more about their surroundings. The routines, the rules, the faces of the guards who patrolled without menace. But that first meal remained etched in their memories, a moment of unexpected humanity amid the ruins of ideology. It was the meal that began to unmake years of hatred. The meal that made them question everything they had believed about who was good and who was evil. And perhaps in that quiet hall, something changed not just for them, but for the Americans as well. Because kindness, once given, has a way of echoing, even across language, even across history. The food was real, the warmth was real, And for those German women, that first night in an American camp was the moment they realized that even after a war as cruel as theirs, the world still had room for grace. The first bites had been cautious, almost fearful, but soon a quiet transformation began to ripple across the hall. Forks scraped against trays. Soft gasps, sighs, and murmured words filled the air as the women realized what they were eating. The food was not only edible, it was extraordinary. The stew was thick, seasoned, and full of tender vegetables and meat. The bread was soft, still warm from the oven. The butter, real, golden butter, melted the instant it touched the bread's surface. And the dessert, a small slice of pie, gleamed with a sweetness none of them had tasted in years. Apples, real apples, sugar, cinnamon. Each bite seemed to pull them backward through time, to a world before the air raids, before ration books, before hunger had become a way of life. One of the women, Anna, stared at her tray as if it were a mirage. In 1944, she'd watched her younger sister die from malnutrition. For months afterward, she'd eaten whatever she could find: old potatoes, grass boiled into a bitter soup, bread made from sawdust and barley husks. The last thing she'd tasted that had even a trace of sweetness was a lump of beet sugar stolen from a factory near the Rhine. Now, as she bit into the American pie, her throat tightened. It was too good, too clean, too human. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. Across from her, another woman, older, with streaks of grey in her hair, looked around nervously, as if expecting punishment for enjoying it. In the camps back home, food was survival, not pleasure. Eating too slowly meant losing your portion to someone stronger. But here, no one was taking anything from them. Everyone had their own tray, their own piece of comfort. They feed us like guests. She whispered under her breath. Why? No one answered. They didn't know. Somewhere near the serving line, two American cooks exchanged glances. They'd seen reactions like this before. Every new batch of prisoners arrived the same way. Tense, skeptical, waiting for cruelty. And every time, the moment they ate, something softened in their faces. One of the cooks, a young man from Kansas, leaned toward his partner and muttered, "You'd think they never had pie before." The other shook his head. Not like this, they didn't. Back at the tables, the women were beginning to talk, hesitant at first, then more openly as the shock gave way to quiet amazement. "It's so sweet," one said, holding up a forkful of pie as if to make sure it was real. "Too sweet." Another replied, laughing softly, the first genuine laugh to escape her in months. "Even the butter tastes like heaven." Someone asked about the milk. It came in metal jugs, cold and smooth, poured into tin cups that steamed slightly in the warm room. One sip and they were children again, sitting in kitchens that no longer existed. For some, it was too much to bear. Tears fell quietly, not from sorrow but from a strange, aching gratitude. The sweetness made them remember what had been lost. Families, homes, the simplicity of a warm meal shared in peace. The American guards, standing by the walls, watched in silence. They had seen enemy soldiers before, defiant, proud, sometimes broken, but never like this. These were young women, some barely old enough to be out of school. They looked more like refugees than prisoners. A few guards turned away, unable to keep looking. War was supposed to make things clear, who was right, who was wrong. But this blurred every line. After dinner, when the trays were collected, the cooks offered seconds. The reaction was almost disbelief. One woman held her tray protectively, as though refusing to risk such generosity twice. Another hesitated, then smiled awkwardly when the cook ladled more stew onto her plate. "Danke," she said, her accent thick. The cook nodded and said softly, "You're welcome." It was the first time she'd heard an American voice speak to her without contempt. It struck her harder than the food itself. Later that evening, back in their quarters, the women couldn't stop talking about it. "They gave us butter," One said in a whisper, as if naming something sacred, "Real butter, not that yellow grace we had in the factories." Another smiled faintly in the dim light. "And the bread, it tasted alive. Can you imagine? Bread that's alive." They laughed quietly at the phrasing, but it was true. The bread had been warm, soft, forgiving, everything the last years of their lives hadn't been. For many of them, sweetness had become a memory of peace itself. During the war, sugar had vanished from German life. What little there was went to the military or the black market. Most civilians learned to sweeten their coffee with saccharin tablets or beet extract. Even children forgot what real chocolate tasted like. To taste sweetness again now in captivity was almost too symbolic to grasp. It was like being told the war was over not by generals or speeches, but by the quiet kindness of flavor. As the days passed, the routine of meals continued. Each breakfast, lunch, and dinner brought the same quiet astonishment. Eggs, real eggs, scrambled with milk, potatoes seasoned with herbs, porridge topped with sugar and syrup, and always fresh bread. It seemed endless. They began to understand that the Americans weren't just feeding them to keep them alive. They were showing them something, perhaps unintentionally, about what life could be without hate, without scarcity, without propaganda. The more they ate, the more they began to talk among themselves about how wrong they had been. Before capture, they had been warned that American camps were brutal, that the enemy would starve them or treat them like animals. Some even believed they would be executed upon arrival. Yet here they were, served warm food by polite young men who said "ma'am" instead of shouting orders. The contradiction was overwhelming. One night, Anna wrote in her small notebook, a single page left from before her capture. Her pencil shook as she wrote the words, "They give us food we did not deserve. They show mercy we cannot return. How can I hate them now?" She closed the book and stared at the ceiling for a long time, the smell of sweet bread still lingering on her hands. For many of the women, the taste of sweetness did something subtle yet powerful. It broke through years of conditioning. They had been raised to believe that kindness was weakness, that softness was to be scorned. Yet here was a nation, victorious, feeding its defeated enemies with gentleness. That contradiction burned in their hearts. In the weeks that followed, their guards noticed a change. The women began to smile more easily, speak with less fear. Some offered to help clean the kitchen or wash the trays. Others began to pick up English words from overheard conversations. Thank you. Good. Bread. It wasn't forced. It was gratitude made visible. Sometimes, late at night, when the camp was quiet and the stars shone above the fences, a few women would whisper about what awaited them back home. Would there be food like this in Germany again? Would there be kindness like this? No one knew, but for the first time hope, fragile and tentative, began to return. They had lost everything in the war, but in this strange, unexpected way, they were being taught what it meant to rebuild, not through speeches or politics, but through simple human gestures. A plate of food, a cup of milk, a slice of pie. There were moments of guilt too, sharp, painful flashes of conscience. Some of them had worked in factories that supplied weapons. Some had brothers or fathers who had fought fiercely against the Americans. To receive kindness from those they had been told to hate created a weight in their chests that words couldn't lift. "We don't deserve this," one whispered one morning, staring at her breakfast. Her friend nodded slowly. "No one does. That's why it means something." The sweetness of the food became a symbol of everything they didn't understand about America, and everything they suddenly wanted to. It wasn't about victory or defeat anymore. It was about humanity, the simple, quiet kind that survives even after the worst of wars. When news arrived months later that some of them would be repatriated to Germany, the emotions were mixed. Relief, of course, but also sadness. They had come to associate this camp, this unlikely place, with a kind of healing. For years, they had lived surrounded by bitterness, fear, and deprivation. And here, in the heart of what they once called the enemy's land, they had rediscovered sweetness, both literal and spiritual. On their final day, the cooks prepared one last meal: roast meat, vegetables, bread, and of course pie. Many of the women took their time eating, as though trying to memorize the taste. Some slipped crumbs of bread into their pockets, not out of hunger, but as tokens, reminders that mercy had a flavor, and it was sweet. As the sun dipped low and the trucks waited by the gates once again, one of the guards approached Anna. He handed her a small paper bag. Inside was a single slice of apple pie, wrapped carefully in wax paper. "For the road," he said simply. She stared at it, unable to speak. Then, with trembling hands, she took it and whispered, "Danke." As the trucks rolled away, dust rising behind them, the women looked back at the camp through the slats in the wooden panels. The mess hall was still visible, glowing faintly in the evening light. It seemed, for a fleeting moment, like a beacon in a broken world. The war had taken everything from them: homes, families, certainty. But it was in captivity, under the flag of their enemy, that they had found a taste of something they thought was gone forever. Sweetness, dignity, hope. They couldn't believe how fresh, how sweet, how impossibly kind it all was. And in that disbelief, something beautiful took root. The understanding that even after history's darkest years, humanity still had the power to taste good again. The mornings in the camp had begun to take on a rhythm, gentle and predictable, far removed from the chaos of war. The sun rose over the distant fields, spilling gold across the wooden barracks and the rows of neatly lined tents. Inside the mess hall, the same ritual unfolded every day: the clatter of trays, the quiet hum of conversation, the steaming aroma of freshly baked bread and scrambled eggs. For the German women, each meal became more than sustenance. It became a lens through which they saw their captors in an entirely new light. These were not men and women bent on punishment. They were ordinary people performing an extraordinary act of humanity, offering care where vengeance could have been expected. It began subtly. A glance exchanged between a guard and a prisoner, a slight nod, a polite "ma'am." As trays were handed out, these small gestures carried a weight far greater than words could convey. The women, once hardened by propaganda and fear, began to see their captors as individuals, human beings with their own families, stories, and hopes. For some, it was disorienting. Every act of kindness seemed almost tactical, too deliberate to be genuine. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the constancy of these actions left no room for doubt. There was no deception, only care. The women began to smile more often, their laughter, hesitant at first, becoming genuine as they shared stories from home. From before the war, memories that had been buried under rubble and fear. Breakfast was particularly transformative. Fresh milk in tin cups, eggs cooked to perfection, thick slices of buttered bread. The simplest of items carried profound significance. One young woman, Maria, would watch the sunlight glint off the polished tables as she ate, feeling a strange warmth in her chest. She had grown up in Berlin, surviving air raids and ration lines, her childhood defined by the scarcity of sugar and the bitter taste of boiled vegetables. Here, in the quiet of an American camp, she could savor the sweetness she had been denied for years. It was not just a physical sweetness, it was a sweetness of spirit, a message that life could still hold gentleness. Other women, observing Maria's reaction, began to realize that they were experiencing the same awakening. The act of being fed well, consistently, and without judgment was reshaping their perception of the enemy. Conversations in the evenings became another form of nourishment. Around the long wooden tables, the women would recount small stories from their lives, sometimes laughing softly at shared memories, sometimes pausing, letting silence fill the gaps where grief lingered. The American guards listened politely, occasionally offering an encouraging word. The simple act of being acknowledged as human, and not as a faceless other, began to chip away at the walls that propaganda and war had built. These interactions, punctuated by the warmth of shared meals, created a bridge between two worlds that had been forced apart by violence and suspicion. The emotional impact of the food and the kindness extended far beyond the dining hall. During chores, some women volunteered to help sweep the floors or carry supplies, gestures of gratitude, small and deliberate, that reflected their growing sense of agency and dignity. They no longer felt like passive captives waiting for fate to decide their next moment. Instead, they became participants in a shared human experience, one defined not by fear, became a silent testimony to the possibility of reconciliation. The lessons learned around the table extended beyond individual realization. Bonds formed among the women themselves, strengthened by shared experiences of surprise and wonder. They began to look out for each other more attentively, offering small gestures of kindness, whether it was helping someone reach for a plate or saving the last slice of bread. The sweetness of the food was mirrored in their actions, a reflection of empathy nurtured in an environment that encouraged it. For many, this was the first time in years they had felt part of a community that functioned not on fear or hierarchy, but on mutual respect and shared humanity. Even the smallest details were etched into memory. The way sunlight glinted off the trays, the slight tilt of a coffee cup, the steam rising from a bowl of porridge, the quiet murmur of a guard explaining the proper way to eat certain foods. All of it became part of a larger tapestry. Each element, mundane to some, was extraordinary to them. It symbolized a world where care was given freely, and where nourishment was an act of grace rather than obligation. Slowly, the walls in their hearts softened, allowing room for gratitude, reflection, and even hope. By the time the weeks had passed, the transformation was undeniable. The German women, once wary and distrustful, had begun to see their environment and their captors with new eyes. The mess hall, initially a space of apprehension, had become a classroom of humanity. Every meal was a lesson, every gesture a demonstration that even in the aftermath of destruction, decency could prevail. The experience was reshaping their understanding of the world. Kindness could exist even where they had expected cruelty. Empathy could emerge where hatred had been taught. The realization was profound and unsettling. They could not undo the past, but in this place, they glimpsed a future in which human connection might endure. The final weeks of their stay in the camp brought a bittersweet awareness. They had come to rely on the routine, the meals, the quiet gestures of kindness that had become lifelines in an otherwise uncertain existence. They realized that they were leaving not just a place, but a space where they had begun to heal, both physically but by cooperation and mutual respect. The mess hall, once a place of uncertain dread, became a sanctuary. It was here that laughter returned, where whispers of home were shared, and where the bitter taste of war was slowly replaced by something warmer, sweeter, and profoundly human. Meals became a kind of silent language. Every slice of bread, every pat of butter, every spoonful of stew carried unspoken messages: care, patience, and the possibility of redemption. Some women wrote letters in their minds as they ate, imagining how they would describe this experience to family back home. They knew words would fall short. How could they convey the shock of tasting kindness after years of fear? How could they explain the way a meal could make them reconsider everything they had been taught about the enemy? In these moments, the camp became more than a place of confinement. It became a place of revelation, a quiet stage for the profound human realization that generosity and empathy could exist even in the shadow of a global conflict. Outside, the camp itself seemed to reflect this newfound calm. The fields were tidy, the trees casting long shadows across well-kept paths. Guards moved with purpose but without menace, and the prisoners observed, internalizing the stark contrast with the chaos they had left behind in Germany. Every morning walk to the mess hall became a sensory experience, the warmth of sunlight on their faces, the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds. These details, previously unnoticed, now carried significance. They were reminders that life continued, that beauty persisted even after destruction, and in the routine of food, conversation, and quiet observation, the German women began to feel a fragile sense of security, a reassurance that humanity had not been extinguished by war. The consistency of care had an almost therapeutic effect. Night after night, after long hours of reflection in their quarters, the women would speak softly among themselves, sharing thoughts and fears that had remained buried. They compared meals, discussed flavors, and marveled at the care with which the food had been prepared. Each discussion reinforced a central truth: the Americans were not monsters, as propaganda had led them to believe. They were capable of compassion, patience, and understanding, the very act of feeding them physically and emotionally. The food had done more than fill their stomachs. It had opened the door to understanding, challenged preconceived notions, and restored a sense of dignity stripped away by war. As they prepared for repatriation, many of the women carried these lessons within them, tasting not only the sweetness of pie and buttered bread, but the profound realization that empathy, even across enemy lines, could transform hearts. They left with gratitude, awe, and a quiet determination to remember the lessons learned. The sweetness of the meals lingered, not merely as flavor, but as a symbol of the humanity that persisted despite global conflict. They had seen the enemy through new eyes, understood the power of compassion, and experienced the profound impact of something as simple as a well-prepared meal. In that American camp, they had discovered that even after unimaginable suffering, the human heart could still recognize and respond to kindness, that the act of feeding someone could resonate far beyond nourishment, and that peace could begin, quietly, one meal at a time.